The following is a recording of our free educational webinar, Tomato Variety Trends, How Breeding Influences Your Seed Selection, which took place on January 19th, 2023. We hope you enjoy our presentation.
I'd like to briefly introduce our presenters today. Pete Zook has been a product manager with Johnny's for over 9 years. He manages many of the fruiting crops as well as alliums, corn, and potatoes. He's responsible for the product assortment for these crops and for directing the product development goals of our tomato, squash, and onion breeding programs. Daniel Yoder is a vegetable production technician on Johnny's research team. Daniel coordinates the annual tomato trials along with those of numerous other crops at Johnny's research farm here in Maine, collecting data and analyzing and reporting on results. Daniel is also instrumental in product development and education for numerous crops. Okay, and with that said, I'm going to step back and have Pete and Dan start our presentation.
All right, thanks, Joshua. Yeah, welcome to the webinar. Thanks for attending. It's a little bit of a different topic, something I did a presentation on this a couple weeks ago at a conference for the first time. It's one I've tossed around a lot. It's come from my work traveling around and meeting with breeders all over the world to discuss what they're working on for new varieties. And it's not necessarily going to be about tomatoes with stripes or cherry tomatoes with good flavor. We'll talk about a little bit about tomato types, but a lot of it is about what is going on behind the scenes in the world of plant breeding that is really determining what is available on the market today for tomato varieties. And my hope is that you'll come out of this understanding a little bit better some of the things that you see in your seed catalog, why certain disease resistances are or are not available, why some types seem to be more available than others, why you might not be able to find the thing exactly that you're looking for in a tomato. And then we'll highlight some varieties that are good examples of the things we're talking about. So just to kind of preface this talk, I mentioned, traveling around and talking to breeders in different places. It's probably not a secret to most of you, but I think you know that we don't grow and produce all the seed that we sell in the Johnny's catalog at our farm in Maine, which is pictured here. We purchase the vast majority of our seeds from breeding companies all over the world and what we call multipliers who produce open pollinated varieties. And those companies have, their businesses, they have breeding targets, they have goals they're trying to meet and for growers all over the place. At Johnny's, we just don't have the capacity to grow all the seed that we sell. So that's why we bring it in. The advantage of this is that, you have these big research-based companies that can focus on the breeding work and develop new varieties, and then they produce seed in large quantities, which dealers like Johnny's or High Mowing or Harris will then purchase wholesale and repack and sell. And then we deal with all the customer service stuff and having a website and all those things that the breeding companies don't want to deal with. Because they focus so much on research, those companies are able to deliver varieties with very nice qualities for a professional grower or for an avid home gardener. So you're going to see varieties that have really good yield, a lot of marketable fruit and uniformity, a lot of disease resistance, nice plant habits that work well in your systems, because they're really tailoring things to a grower's needs. It's not to say that an old heirloom tomato can't be productive and certainly more delicious than most of the hybrid varieties out there, but that breeding work more or less ended 100 years ago. Now you have companies making a lot of big advances. So we're talking mostly about modern varieties today. And this system allows companies to focus on what they're good at. Now we do breed tomatoes here at Johnny's, but even with our breeding, we have a finite capacity. We have our own targets that we can focus on, and we kind of max out the ability that we have to breed for those things. So we're turning to other companies to provide us with other types of varieties. There are some downsides to sourcing seeds from other companies. One is that there may be limited varieties available with adaptation to certain climates, specifically New England is one. If an area is not economically important to tomato production, then it's not going to get a lot of attention for breeding. The northern tier of the United States, while a lot of growers are growing fresh tomatoes for fresh market and in home gardens, those are not necessarily important areas globally for things like processing tomatoes and big beefsteaks that are going to end up in food service and things like that. And a lot of companies focus their effort breeding for those regions. So sometimes you can find that your geographic area is kind of left out of the mix. Another downside is that as a seed dealer like Johnny's, we don't have much control over the life cycle of um, breeding varieties. So this is where you might see one of your favorite varieties get dropped from our catalog. Maybe it wasn't our choice to do that. Maybe the company that bred it decided that it wasn't selling well enough. Maybe it didn't produce enough seed. Some varieties just don't produce seed very easily, and so they don't pencil out. And then sometimes there are these kind of complicated distribution arrangements that breeding companies will have with particular seed dealers where they'll say, well, we want this dealer to represent our varieties in the southeast, and then this company can sell our varieties in the north or in the west. But that might result in one company or another not having access to particular varieties. So you might see varieties in other seed catalogs that you don't see in the Johnny's catalog, and you'll wonder, well, why doesn't Johnny sell that? It's a great variety. Well, maybe we're just not allowed to because of weird distribution agreements. The other thing is that sourcing seed can be very expensive. And I'm sure some of you have seen some sticker shock in your Johnny's catalog, and I'll actually talk about that right now. A question we get a lot is why and how is tomato seed in particular often so expensive? And in particular, I'm talking about the greenhouse varieties and some other types like grapes. Um, and I'll address that. On the supply side of things, breeding costs a lot of money. It's a lot of work. I have some photos here of what goes into it. Just a lot of tedious selecting of things, hand pollination, a lot of record keeping. There's a lot of travel involved to different locations to test things out, and it can often take 10 years from concept to developing a finished variety that's ready for sale. And there's just a lot of investment that goes into that. And for every variety that makes it to the end and becomes a big beef or whatever, there are thousands of varieties that don't make it. So it's just a tremendous amount of work that you're trying to recoup an investment on. And then when you're talking about hybrid tomatoes, the seed production itself is very labor intensive. There's a lot of hand pollinating going on, and a lot of, again, tedious work. And also the seed yield can vary greatly for different types of tomatoes. So grape tomatoes are notoriously poor seed producers. You can plant a whole lot of tomatoes and get very little seeds out of it in the end. So that's what drives the cost up in some ways. We also have a lot of testing that's required, particularly for seed that's moving across borders. Nowadays, there are several viruses. I'll talk a little bit about this later, but that testing cost can slow down the movement of seed and cause late deliveries and jam things up. And it can actually cause, effectively crop failures if seed is being tested for a disease to come into the United States and it fails that test. Well, then you can't sell that seed and you're eating a loss. Another kind of esoteric thing that you hear about in this industry is something called good seed and plant practices. This is a very high-tech methodology for producing greenhouse seed. It's meant to exclude clavibacter, which is a bacterial disease, and it adds a tremendous amount to the cost. And that's a really big reason why greenhouse seed is so expensive. It's just they're trying to keep the diseases out of it. At the end of the day, there's a lot of agriculture involved in seed production and breeding, and there's just all the same risk mitigation that goes with that would go with producing any kind of a crop. Okay. On the demand side, one of the reasons tomato seed can be expensive if it's coming from Europe, the European market bears a much higher price, retail price for seed. So European breeding companies are used to getting more money, basically. They just have a different economy over there. And so European tomato seed can be very pricey. Indoor growers use a lot less seed than outdoor or field growers. So greenhouse seed, if you spend that 10 years to develop a variety and you're only selling a tiny amount of it relative to what you would sell of a field tomato, then you're having to spread out your recouping your investment over a much smaller amount of seed. So that will drive the price up as well. And then if you're looking for organic seed, organic production costs a lot more, and there are not a lot of people doing it on any kind of scale in the world. So it can be difficult to find somebody to produce organic seed for you, particularly of hybrid tomatoes. And when you do, it's very costly. So that's our explanation of why the tomato seed is so expensive. And I hope that takes some of the sting out of it. Um, there are some trends going on with pricing. There's a fair amount of bad news, like with everything these days. Pretty much all seed just got a lot more expensive for us and for everybody. There are a lot of transport costs, supply chain issues that were COVID related. Labor costs are rising in the U.S. and everywhere. So, agricultural labor that goes into producing tomato seed and all seeds is more expensive now. And I mentioned some seed-borne diseases. APHIS in the U.S. Is monitoring 6 virus diseases that exist around the world. Um, Nothing to be worried about here just yet, but seed has to be produced in a place where those viruses don't exist, or else it has to be tested. We also have something called tomato brown rugose fruit virus. That testing is often required before seed can be sold. Testing consumes a lot of seed and again can result in an effective crop failure if the seed doesn't pass. Um, so we also have a lot of issues going on related to these viruses that are causing seed productions to move to different locations. Um, So there used to be a lot of seed, for example, produced in the Gansu province of China, where they have a very large, series of mountain valleys that are isolated. They're arid. They have plenty of irrigation and a lot of expertise for growing seed. They started having issues with viruses there, and so a lot of that production has moved out, and so those production locations are in flux. People have been scrambling the last couple of years to find new places to produce clean seed. Um, on the good side, there are some favorable exchange rate things happening. Both the euro and the yen are really low to the dollar right now. So in some cases, we're actually paying less for seed than we were 2-3 years ago. We're also seeing a trend with indoor tomato varieties that you would want to grow in a high tunnel. Some of those prices are coming down because traditionally those were produced for high-tech growers using that GSPP process I talked about, and they were mostly coming from Europe, so they were very expensive. But now breeders in other countries using different seed production methods are starting to breed these varieties that are good for a tunnel with the same disease resistances. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but those prices are coming down, specifically the leaf mold resistant varieties. So now I'll get into some of the trends that we're seeing, and I'm gonna scroll down through my notes here. Um, right now we're seeing that varieties are able to make it to market faster. I mentioned it could take 10 years to breed a tomato from start to finish. That time is shrinking rapidly now. We have something called marker assisted selection. This is where you can grow a very tiny plant, just a little seedling. Here's a image below of our breeding team working on that. Little leaf sample from something that you grew for just a couple of weeks, and you can send that off to a lab, and that lab can run some genetic tests and tell you with a pretty good degree of accuracy if that tomato will have a particular disease resistance or not. That prevents you from having to grow those plants to full size and test them in the field. It reduces the amount of land you're going to use for your breeding nursery, and it also enables you to speed up things since you're not waiting for those plants to get full size. And some companies who have the resources to travel can do up to 3 generations of tomato breeding in a year. So they're really speeding things up very quickly, and that's really being driven in part by the rapid development of disease issues. This is a climate change related thing. We're getting more diseases spreading farther and wider. There's just very intense competition out there too to catch up with those diseases, and so companies are racing to be first to market with new varieties that are more productive and more disease resistant. So a little bit of that genetic testing can replace a whole lot of farm work and get you your varieties quicker. Another trend that we're seeing is that independent breeders are gaining ground on some of the bigger companies. These photos here, we have Jason Cavatorta from Earthwork Seeds, which was a startup just a few years back, and Fred Hempel, who bred the artisan seeds there. These are folks who, they're based in the U.S. They are passionate about breeding, and they took a dream and turned it into a company. And now that this marker assisted technology is becoming more available, even smaller breeders, independent breeders like Jason and Fred are able to access that technology affordably and employ it and achieve breeding targets in a very sophisticated way, just like the big companies in the world. And what's nice about this is that these folks are more inclined to work on those less commercially important breeding targets that I was talking about, like regions that don't have good varieties bred and don't have the right complement of disease resistances for your market. An independent breeder might be more likely to work on that, and they tend to be a lot more creative with their products. They focus more on flavor. I'm generalizing, but that's what we tend to see. And then as far as working with them, working with big companies, you do get that quality, but you're now getting the quality from independent breeders. Plus, they're a lot more flexible and agile with their business, and they're open to collaboration with breeding companies like Johnny's. So there's a lot of benefits to the customer and to the seed dealer as well from having these independent breeders getting after it and being more successful with their work now. Daniel's going to highlight some of our independent bred varieties that are some of the coolest varieties we offer.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. I was also want to mention I would put Johnny's into that independent breeding category too, and I could start with one of our varieties on this list is Cherry Bomb, and this is a cherry that was. Oh, sorry, I was actually going to talk about that one later. Um, so Hot Streak is here on the list. Mark McCaslin. This is a introduction this year. We are really excited for this tomato because it's a real breakthrough in the specialty large fruited category. We've had some heirloom quality traits in hybrids before, but Hot Streak is showing equal production and plant vigor and disease package to a lot of the standard varieties that we sell for indoor and outdoor growers, honestly. And we've been looking at it for a few years and have gotten really good feedback from some grower trials that we've done regionally. The first time we saw it was really impressive with how early it produces a lot of fruit. And that's really important in the high tunnel segment where it is um, most favorable. And compared to something like green zebra is what a lot of people are familiar with in this category. It's like I said a lot earlier and larger fruit, but I think they'll make it like a nice mix for heirloom type tomatoes in a tray. The next one I wanted to highlight here is Green Bee, as Pete mentioned or introduced Fred Hempel from Artisan Seeds already. He was the breeder of Green Bee. This is a hybrid version of his Bumblebee tomatoes. It is a green ripe tomato that he's done a lot of work with in field testing and has seen it hold up to. Fred doesn't do marker selection to so that we can officially list disease resistances on a variety, but he does field tolerance trials and has seen this hold up really well in a lot of places to a lot of the California and important diseases out there like early blight and bacterial spot. Um, and then he's also done a lot of work with it in the restaurant segment, which is a bummer for us that it was launched in 2020, the year of the pandemic, when restaurant sales had been really low for a lot of growers. So we haven't seen a lot of people pick up this variety yet, but we think it's kind of a hidden gem in there. It's got this really unique crunchy texture, which comes from the Rin gene in it, and it can just sit and develop flavor on the plant for weeks and weeks, and you can basically pick it whenever you want to. And that texture also lends really well to a lot of interesting culinary uses like grilling and roasting the tomato. So anyway, that's a really great one I wanted to highlight from independent breeding. And lastly, here I wanted to highlight Sepola's Pride, which is a really fun one for us. This came to us in probably 2017, 16 or 17 as a customer donation, and it comes from Larry Sepola, who is a avid master gardener out in Minnesota, and he has this family heirloom who he had been maintaining for many years, long enough to define it as a heirloom in most ways. So we have worked with him. The first time we saw it, we were like really impressed with the uniformity, the potential of this variety for the size and flavor and uniformity, and worked together to refine it into the great heirloom product it is now.
Yeah, I think Larry is in attendance today, so shout
Oh,
out to
great.
Larry. All right. Another big trend in tomatoes is that, particularly for large fruited indeterminates, but really all types of tomatoes, growers, particularly in the northern climates, are trying to move them indoors, so where they can control the environment, maximize productivity, and increase their profits. And for growers who have tunnels, for many of them, tomatoes are far and away the most profitable crop. And so they grow a lot of tomatoes in tunnels, which leads us to our next trend, which is grafting. When you grow a lot of tomatoes in your tunnels and you're not able to rotate into other crops, you build up a lot of diseases in your soil. And grafting is a great way to get around that. Um, I think Dan was going to take this topic and run with it because he's really the grafting expert here.
Yeah, I can add a couple things in the grafting section. A couple trends that we've been seeing for this is, as Pete mentioned, it's still kind of an increasing category. The Some of the high tech varieties where grafting is pretty much the standard now. This is really long production cycles. They are actually releasing varieties that don't even have any soil disease resistances. So they're so focused on the grafted plant that they don't even need to work on that in breeding, which is great. But then it's a less adaptable variety for our diverse customers. So that's one thing we're seeing. And another thing is that we're seeing a lot of local growers who are propagating grafted plants. We actually don't sell grafted plants anymore. We sell the seeds and supplies. And a great way, if you're interested in grafting, I think it might add a lot of value to what you're doing. If you are looking for an extended season or have disease pressure, that's really a great place to start with grafting, or think you might run into issues later. You could um, look to and maybe someone who's growing plants locally if you're not interested in grafting yourself. But honestly, from experience, it's one of the easiest vegetable species to graft, and I think, yeah, if you're interested in that, you certainly give it a go. We have a couple resources on that and a webinar too that you can and check out, and there's plenty of great resources online now too.
Yeah, I think that's the trend is I think a lot of folks are not intimidated to try grafting anymore, and it's become a matter of fact practice on a lot of even really small farms. So we're going to shift the talk to disease resistance now, because disease resistance in tomatoes is always one of the major thrusts of any breeding program. And so I'll just kind of talk a little bit about where disease resistance comes from. Fundamentally, it often comes from wild type tomatoes. There's pictures on the right of what a couple of different wild species look like. These often have within them natural disease resistance that can be borrowed and brought into tasty beefsteak tomatoes. Another place that it can come from is just you happen to have let's say you have a big field full of tomatoes in your breeding program and you're doing selections and you happen to get a particular disease fairly often and you find an individual that doesn't seem to be affected by that disease, well, chances are you have some resistance to work with there. And then wherever fundamentally it comes from, it's often developed by university breeding programs. We owe a lot to universities like Cornell and NC State, University of Wisconsin. They have very strong vegetable breeding programs at some of these land grant universities. They get grant money to work on developing resistance. This is very difficult breeding work, takes a really long time to take a tiny little tomato like that and make it into something that you actually want to eat. And those types of projects could kill a breeding company that's trying to pay for it and recoup the cost selling seed. So that's why those university breeding programs are very critical. And breeders can, commercial breeders, for-profit breeders can work with those universities to license those resistance genetics. A lot of breeders also get their resistance from existing commercial varieties. If you take your favorite tomato plant, collect the seeds from it, from the hybrid, you'll get what's called a segregating population of hundreds of individuals that all look completely different, but some of them are going to have the traits that you're looking for, including disease resistance. It's tedious, but if you really want a resistance and you don't know how else to get it, you can do it that way. It's kind of a, I don't know if you'd call it a gentleman's agreement or what you'd call it. All breeders do it, but you're running a risk. Some varieties are patented, so if you are going to do that kind of thing, you want to do your homework and make sure that that your variety that you're breeding with is not patented and you're not violating anybody's intellectual property rights. Disease resistance codes. This will not be on the quiz specifically, but I did want to just bring this up just for a little education on it. We at Johnny's, when we talk about disease resistance, we have a phonetic abbreviation for each disease resistance. It's very simple so the customer can understand. But out there in the world, there's a whole Latin-based system for naming disease resistance genes, and it gets very complicated. Some diseases have multiple genes that are mentioned. Some have Latin names that change year to year. I'll give you some examples of those. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that if you're shopping for tomato seed, you may not see the same abbreviations from one catalog to the other. There's a link below to a resource that is at the International Seed Foundation's official list of official disease codes for tomatoes. Worth checking out. If you're ever confused, you see something like LT or SBL/SL/SS, doesn't make a lot of sense to the layperson. And even for folks like Daniel and I that work in tomatoes all the time, I sometimes see an abbreviation and have no idea what disease they're talking about. So a little confusion can be created there. Yeah, so just be aware of that. I'm getting the wrong button here. Uh-oh, there we are. So some of the trends, kind of overarching trends we're seeing with disease resistance. One, I kind of alluded to this earlier, that it's the warm climate diseases really dominate the tomato breeding world. If you're watching this from down south, Florida, the Carolinas, you might be familiar with tomato spotted wilt, tomato yellow leaf curl, Fusarium race 3. You might have nematode issues. Those are very common problems in the subtropical and arid sort of Mediterranean type climates where a lot of tomatoes are produced commercially. And because those areas consume a lot of seed, that's where a lot of breeding companies focus their breeding effort. So those things are some companies I go visit these days. I'm looking for tomatoes for the United States, temperate United States, but all they have is stuff that's bred for diseases in the South, and that can have some drawbacks, which I'll get to. I will say though that the temperate climate diseases are finally starting to get more attention, and due in part to a lot of the independent breeders who are out there, but also collectively the fresh market demand for tomato seed in the north and in the more temperate climates has just reached a threshold where some of the bigger companies are even starting to focus on it. We'll talk more about those diseases specifically. With climate change, we're seeing diseases that were typically known for being problems in the south starting to move north. Some of them are spread by insects that don't overwinter well, and now those insects are able to survive. Just lost a bunch of snow off the roof. Um, in climates where they couldn't before. Other diseases themselves just prefer really warm, humid climates. Pretty common thing. Stemphillium is a good example of that. The gray leaf spot. It's very common in the south, becoming more common in the north. Another thing we're seeing is that companies are being more specific with listing the disease resistance genes. There are often multiple races of different pathogens, similar to what you see with downy mildew races in lettuce and spinach, and that's starting to become a thing that you'll see with tomatoes. I think we struggle a little bit with, are we going to start doing this in the Johnny's catalog? You know, getting these really complicated, very scientific looking terminal, abbreviations for our disease resistances, or are we going to stay with a phonetic way of doing it? But the fact is, you have a lot of growers that really are getting more knowledgeable, needing to know, do they have this or that specific resistance gene? And it's not a trend, but I'm going to talk now about how new disease resistances that come on the market may come with some baggage, and I'll explain that really quickly. There's a little phenomenon we call linkage drag in the breeding world. That's what happens is you often have something desirable like a disease resistance gene, and it'll sit on a chromosome, and somewhere very close to that nice gene that you want might be something that you don't want, like, bad flavor, or um, cracking, or some other trait that's going to wreck your tomato. And when you're breeding, it can be very difficult if those things are very closely located on the chromosome. It can be difficult to separate them. And we say that they're linked. So sometimes a bad trait can be linked to a good trait. And a lot of breeding work can do away with that, but it takes time. So what this means for you is that some of the new varieties that hit the market with a new resistance that you haven't seen before might have some compromises. I use Defiant, Johnny's bread variety, as an example. It has late blight resistance. It was one of the first tomatoes to have that resistance. It's generally a pretty nice variety, productive, tastes good. But if you've ever grown it, you've probably said, these fruit are pretty small. I wish they were bigger. Well, we agreed, but we really needed to get late blight resistant varieties out on the market, so we decided to put Defiant out. But in the meantime, we kept working with late blight resistance until we were able to develop some varieties that had more desirable traits, like our newer variety Abigail, which is kind of like a brandywine, big fruit type thing with a lot of good flavor and juicy texture and all that. And it looks like an heirloom. So we had to wait a few years from Defiant to Abigail. It just depends on kind of what your strategy is. So you may have to wait a while to get all the traits that you want in a variety with a new resistance. So looking at some disease resistance trends, I mentioned Defiant with the late blight resistance. This genetics became common on the market 8 to 10 years ago. There was a lot of late blight pressure going on in the United States. I actually have a little map here I'll flip to. In 2014, for example, there were just outbreaks all over the Northeast and even out in the West Coast. It's calmed down quite a bit in recent years. You see a big blob in northern Maine. That's actually potatoes, which also get late blight. So, 8 to 10 years ago, late blight was a major concern. And NC State University released some really nice genes for that that do really well. It's also a common problem in Europe, and they get the same late blight that we do, which is actually a benefit to the tomato world in a way, because European breeding companies are also breeding late blight resistant varieties. That means there are more available and some more interesting varieties available. What else can I say about that? There was some minor linkage drag. It was mostly fruit quality related stuff. Some mealy texture in early late blight resistant varieties. Also the smaller fruit, but there's been a lot of work done, and nowadays you're getting really nice quality varieties. There are varying levels of resistance out there. There are two genes, pH2 and pH3. Ideally, your tomato will have both of those genes. If it has just one or the other, it's not going to be as strong. This is where I talk about those different strains, and it can be important to know what you got. But generally, if a variety is advertising late blight resistance, it's going to do pretty well for you. And Dan's going to highlight a few of those varieties that we're selling now, if I can just find the slide. There we go.
Yeah, so here's our full list of late blight resistances in the catalog. Um, as Pete mentioned, it's yeah, something that's we've focused on for a while in our breeding program, starting with Defiant, which is a really old variety. We now have Abigail, which he also mentioned. That's very similar to Damsel. Both of those varieties are field indeterminate pink beefsteaks, and we are a little bit partial to pink tomatoes at Johnny's. We feel like they have a superior flavor quality. They can be pretty tangy and interesting, and we really love them both. So they have different strengths that we kept both of them. Damsel tends to be a little bit stronger and vegetative of a plant and have an even stronger tangy flavor. And it has some root resistances to it that Abigail does not. But with Abigail, it brings that more brandy wine look, a little bit larger fruit, more ribbing, and a little bit better on the crack tolerance. Another one I wanted to highlight is Cherry Bomb. Now is also late blight resistant, and um, this is one that's actually developed by crossing a grape and a cherry um, parents, and that gives it a more meaty texture and that little bit elongated cherry shape. We give it an easy choice in our cherry section, which is important to think about. Well, that's just an easy one to grow. We've done a lot of regional trialing with varieties that come out of our breeding program, since we essentially are the only ones that have seen them before they get out to the customer. We don't want to just launch it out to the catalog before getting to see how it performs in different regions with more heat pressure, different disease pressures, and things like that. And this one has performed really well, and we've had that since 2016. And then I wanted to highlight Mountain Magic, which is not pictured here, but this is also a really strong variety. It's not a new variety, but actually maybe I should have started with this one. This is actually a release from Randy Gardner, who Pete briefly mentioned NC State. He is now retired, but still actively breeding and responsible for a tremendous amount of late blight resistance work to the industry. And a lot of the varieties you see actually use a parent line from Randy Gardner often. And yeah, Mountain Magic, I just want to make a mention of that one. It's one that works really well for tunnels and in the field, has Fusarium 3, late blight, and also shows a lot of good field tolerance to early blight.
Yeah, and I will just mention some bad news on the cherry bomb. I didn't before we started this. I was just kind of looking some things over, and yeah, we had a crop failure on that, so yeah, there's no seed available this year. But it looks good in the picture.
We'll say too, we don't see a lot of late blight resistant cherries yet, so it's nice to have that
No,
option, especially in organic seed. But
yeah,
when we get it
well,
back, of course.
yeah, we do generally see that small fruited tomatoes stand up to foliar diseases better. They just don't have as much stress on them
It's
with the
true.
smaller fruit, I think is what's going on there. This next one, Septoria and Alternaria, I put them both on the same slide because they tend to kind of go hand in hand. I would say Septoria, I don't know which one's more common, but I think if you live on planet Earth and you grow tomatoes, you've probably seen Septoria and or early blight at some point. Ubiquitous disease problems, and as the pictures show, they can be devastating. Um, to date, there have been some varieties with Alternaria, or I'm sorry, early blight is also known as Alternaria. There have been some varieties with Alternaria resistance. There had not been a gene identified for that resistance, which means it's a lot harder to breed for it. You really have to see things in the field. There's no easy route, and there was no known resistance to Septoria in the tomato world until recently. Martha Mutchler at Cornell University recently retired as well, but she did a tremendous amount of work over many years developing those resistances to those diseases from wild type tomatoes, and very tediously building them into varieties or into breeding lines that can be turned into varieties that you would actually want to eat. Um, and it's going to be not long before those resistances start to hit the market. I know many breeders are working with those breeding lines now, including us. I don't think I'd be giving away the family jewels if I mentioned that. I think we'd be stupid not to be working with them, actually. But at the moment, you're not going to find a lot of resistant varieties, particularly to Septoria. We do have a few that are resistant to Alternaria. Daniel mentioned Mountain Magic. It also has what we call, field tolerance and observed resistance. Cherry Bomb has some, and Galahad, which we don't list it as being resistant, um, but this is a early determinate, which over the years we've observed to have some pretty decent resistance. So um, unfortunately, this is there are breeders working with it, mostly independent breeders in the U.S. It's not a big focus for a lot of the bigger companies that we source from yet, but I hope to see more of it soon. But there are enough talented breeders working on this that I'm very optimistic that we'll be seeing a lot more varieties in the near future. Another big disease issue as folks move into tunnels and greenhouses for more of their tomato production is leaf mold. We just call it leaf mold. It goes by many names. This one is really a pain because they keep changing the Latin name of the fungus that causes it, and there are different races of it as well. And I just kind of gave you a little bit of an example of the alphabet soup there of all the different disease codes that you'll see attributed to leaf mold. But it's a very common disease indoors in these humid areas where there's not a lot of air movement, particularly in humid climates. Um, Traditionally, you've only found leaf mold resistance in the very most expensive high-tech greenhouse tomatoes because, well, they're bred. That the greenhouse industry is where that resistance was most important, and the smaller grower growing in the high tunnel was kind of left out of that conversation. So I mentioned kind of all those things about why tomato seed is so expensive. That applies especially to leaf mold resistance tomatoes. But again, it's getting away from that now, where breeders are starting to make leaf mold resistant varieties for tunnel growers that don't cost $1 a seed. So I think we're going to be seeing more leaf mold resistant varieties in the future as tunnels become a more popular way to grow, as more things go indoors as the climate goes crazy. And as far as I know, it's pretty easy to breed with this gene. There aren't any linkage drag issues associated with it, to my knowledge. And so it's kind of game on for breeding more leaf mold resistant varieties. But we fortunately have several to offer already.
Yeah, and I would add that leaf mold is it's not everything, but it's really one of the primary traits that we require to put things into our greenhouse tomato section. Not everything in there does, but that's really the goal, and I think um, we're going forward. That's definitely the goal. We have a lot of varieties in that category already. You're probably familiar with the French Heritage series and that first generation that we started with. Two of them had leaf mold, but not all three. And the Marnero was the one that didn't. And Marvery was one that is not pictured here, but it's a white, light yellow tomato that was sort of a next generation. They're trying to bring leaf mold into all of the types and colors, and that was the next one to come in. And white tomatoes don't always get a lot of attention. It's really the only beefsteak white that we carry, but it is a really um, early, slightly smaller, fantastic version of an improved heirloom looking tomato. And then another one I wanted to highlight is the Mar Noir, which is there in the top right. And this, we ended up keeping both Mar Noir and Marnero. They're quite similar tomatoes, honestly, but except that the Mar Noir has that strong leaf mold resistance. And in our tunnel trials in Maine, we do get leaf mold, but we don't have nearly the pressure that a lot of our customers have that are slightly warmer and longer season. So we did some really robust trials with Marnoir. What we've seen as another trend in these heirloom hybrid types is that they are bred for a different market that's more of a shipping market. And a lot of times the flavor or the texture is not quite there for our market, or they're too late to mature or something like that. And we really wanted to prove this one out with our customers. And in the end, we didn't remove Marnero anyway, which we really highlight as the flavor and home garden, maybe version of an improved heirloom type. But Marnoir is this really strong, definitely leaf mold resistant variety that's got better production in the end and longevity than Marnero. And yeah, I think that's good
Oh,
for.
sorry. Yeah. I'm gonna start motoring through because we're,
Yeah,
you know, Dan and I can both get a little long-winded, and so here we are. But powdery mildew is another big problem in the indoor growing world, becoming more of a problem that we're hearing more about. There are two different strains of it. One of them there's a gene for, one of them I don't think there is known. When there's not a specific gene for something, it can be very hard to breed resistance. So we just have very few options out there for powdery mildew resistance. Only a couple breeding programs um, that I know of even have the resistance. And we carry three varieties currently: Geronimo, Granadero, and Rebelski, which have really good resistance. And we've seen this in our tunnel in our trials, and it's pretty amazing how well the resistance actually works, because this can be a really damaging disease. But anyway, more powdery mildew resistance is coming as breeders kind of get the handle on how to breed for like a kind of challenging breeding target. Another disease we're hearing more about is gray leaf spot or stymphalium. I mentioned earlier this was one of those diseases that's coming up more from the south. It looks a lot like Septoria, although it does not get on the fruit like some of the other foliar diseases can, like Alternaria. There is a lot of resistance out there. It's a gene that's been around for quite a while, but I don't think it's been a major focus, and so it's kind of scattered. But you can find it if you're looking for it. And I have talked to a lot of breeders lately who are trying to incorporate gray leaf spot resistance into their varieties, kind of as a matter of course now, because it's just such a common disease. Was on a farm in Rhode Island a few years ago where I thought it was nothing but Septoria, and it turns out they didn't even have Septoria. They just had nothing but gray leaf spot. So if you see something like this, get it tested. That's a good point to make, that you probably have a university lab or somewhere that you can send seed or sorry, tissue samples in your state where they can get you a confirmation of what disease problem you're dealing with. And there's a little link down there for some more information on gray leaf spot. And here's what we've got to offer for stymphalium resistant varieties. Dan, favorites?
yeah. Did you want to add? You want me to add the varieties here? Or do we have time to keep going on the descriptions?
Um, what do you mean?
Well, yeah, I can highlight the ones here. The Ruby Dawn is a brand. There's a lot of new varieties that we've seen, as Pete mentioned, in the trials that are having gray leaf spot. Some improvements to the old classics, like the Plus series you see there, are having gray leaf spot added to them if they didn't have it already. Ruby Dawn is one that we're big fans of. There's a Ruby series of tomatoes that you might have seen out there, and this is our favorite one of the series. It's really early, as early as um, early girl, but with a much larger fruit size and a much more robust disease package. And that fruit size that's early on kind of does sacrifice a little bit of the plant size and vigor, but it somehow it doesn't sacrifice the flavor of this variety, and it's always comes out as one of the most flavorful ones. We've put it in the tunnel and in the field, and I will mention that in a tunnel with the smaller plant, it might not have the longevity of some of the tunnel varieties that we offer, but it would work really well as a woven system in the tunnel. And one of our other favorites here that's fairly new, I think we released this one prior year, is Lemon Boy Plus, and this is an improvement on the old Lemon Boy. And it actually surprised us. We didn't carry Lemon Boy before, but as a yellow tomato, it has a lot of flavor to it. One thing I've noticed is that it has a really extended what I call hang time or harvest window for the fruit. It's very crack tolerant, but it has a really great early development of flavor and color. So even at an early breaker stage, that's when it's that bright lemon yellow color, but it'll hold a deep, pretty deep gold color, and maybe even a red blush on the bottom, and still have it'll actually be a little sweeter than, a little bit softer, but have really good marketability compared to other varieties in that class. So yeah, those are two we're really excited about.
Yeah, and the Lemon Boy Plus also has some leaf mold resistance and a nice plant for the tunnel. It did well in our tunnel trial as well. So,
Yeah.
and the Stemphillium will get into the tunnel too. Kind of gets everywhere. So we survived the disease resistance part, and just a few more trends I wanted to touch on before we get to our Q&A. One is we've talked about what we call hylooms, hybrid heirloom types. This, if we're talking about trends in types, this is a really big one that's been kind of brewing for the last several years. And this is coming from commercial, well, kind of a convergence of two worlds really, the fresh market tomato world and the more sort of industrial or commercial large scale production world. The large scale growers want things like firmness and shelf life and uniform ripening of the fruit, because they're going to put things on a truck and expect them to be eaten at on a Whopper with cheese like 2 weeks later. Whereas fresh market growers want flavor, they want something that looks like an heirloom, they want things that ripen on the vine and have nice texture and all that. But those lines are starting to blur where the big markets are now looking for flavor, they're looking for good looks, they want more vine ripened tomatoes. And likewise, the smaller growers are kind of getting squeezed. It's hard to make a living growing brandywine and things like that aren't very productive and don't hold up well when you're hauling them around to your market. So they're starting to ask for things that have more firmness, more shelf life. So you're just starting to see those two worlds combine and getting a lot of varieties out there that have kind of the best of both worlds. So we're kind of in a really rich time for tomato breeding where we're starting to see a lot more creativity in places that you wouldn't expect to see it, which is really nice for the grower. And then just a couple other things that have become trends that breeding is trying to address. One is labor savings. This is just big everywhere. There's a push for more determinate varieties because they require less pruning. We're starting to see, instead of in an indoor situation stringing the tomatoes up a trellis, people are doing what's called a basket weave, which is a less labor intensive way of trellising your tomatoes. And that requires a more open plant habit, different type of tomato. So breeders are trying to address that type of a growing system. Truss harvest is something we're not seeing too much of in the United States in our grower segment yet, but it is big in the greenhouse world, where you harvest the whole truss of the tomato as opposed to individual ones. And that Edox variety down there is a cherry that you can just cut the whole cluster off, and you got a dozen or so tomatoes right there rather than having to pick them off individually. And that's a breeding challenge to create a tomato that can pull that off. We're also seeing more what I call a polite plant habit. Plants that just don't need as much pruning, even if they are indeterminate. Another thing we get a lot of calls for is heat and drought tolerance. That's why I showed the picture of a Estiva there. It's a tomato that will set fruit in very hot weather. In high heat, tomatoes tend to drop their blossoms, and then you don't get any fruit developing. And during hot spells, you can actually see blank spots in the canopy where that hot spell happened, and you lost all your flowers and all your fruit. Estiva is one that really resists the heat. I put BHN 589 up there because it's a determinant that folks are using in a tunnel, and that's another trend that is kind of a combination of two trends: more tomatoes in the tunnel and more determinates. And now people are starting to grow determinates in the tunnel. And Dan, I don't know if you have anything else to add before we wrap up and go to Q&A.
I don't think so. Yeah, it's pretty thorough coverage on that.
All right. Well, thanks for the assist there on the varieties. And yeah, I think we're officially in the QA session. We're kind of close to the end of the hour, but I've got extra time if anyone wants to linger, if that's an option, or does it self-destruct at 3 o'clock?
No, not at all. I think we have some time for the Q&A. I think the presentation was perfectly paced. Thank you both, Pete and Dan. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to briefly introduce our Q&A moderator, Dana Hilfinger. She's been collecting your questions throughout the presentation. Dana has over a decade of experience on diversified fruit and vegetable farms. She has a master's degree from Ohio State in horticulture and crop science, studying high tunnel winter lettuce growing methods. She's worked at extension programs in Ohio State and Central State University, where she ran training programs for beginning farmers in Ohio and provided technical support for market gardeners. And in 2019, she established her own 3-acre no-till farm outside of Columbus, where she grows vegetables year-round and raspberries during the summer. So it's truly a pleasure to have Dana join us and bring her experience. I know she's been collecting everyone's questions and is ready to moderate our Q&A. Take it away, Dana.
Thanks, Joshua. Yeah, thanks everyone for all of the great questions. I just wanted to say before I throw some questions at Dan and Pete, many of you were asking questions about, disease resistance of different tomatoes. And I just wanted to remind people that our website has, some really nice filter options. If you go through the filter on the left side, oftentimes you can sort by disease resistance. So if you're looking for disease resistance varieties that are disease resistant for a certain disease, you can use those filter options. And then also just a short plug for some of the reps that we have around the country. If you're looking for variety selections for a specific region, please feel free to reach out to your commercial reps. I'm the one for Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana, but we have a big team. So, and that information is on our website. But I just wanted to maybe kick it off with, we had a lot of people ask questions about flavor as a priority in breeding efforts. And I was wondering if you guys could speak a little bit more to, where you see flavor kind of prioritized on the list, and also, some questions about whether increased disease resistance often comes at the expense of flavor.
Sure. Yeah, I would say that flavor is becoming more of a focus for companies that didn't typically focus on it before. I think I hinted at it a little bit, where, let's take Florida, for example. They grow a lot of big, rock hard beefsteak tomatoes and processing tomatoes and things, and flavor had not been important there for a long time. But now even the big grocery chains and chain restaurants are starting to hear it from their customers that these tomatoes don't taste good enough. And so even those types of varieties are starting to taste better. But to date, really, it's the smaller, more independent companies, I think, like Johnny's and like Fred Hempel and Earthwork, that have been really focusing more on flavor across the board. The other area where flavor has become really important is in the small fruited varieties that a lot of them you see branded in the grocery store. Those used to kind of taste like cardboard, but now they have to taste good, otherwise the grocery store won't take them. And so it's a real positive trend going on right now. And I think tomatoes are going to finally start tasting better in general. I don't know if Dan has more to add to that.
Yeah, just one thing that comes to mind for me is that it's sort of a fine line between flavor and disease resistance, because you need leaves to make flavor in the fruit. So if you're going to have a variety that has nothing to protect it and you have a lot of pressure in your area, it might just not taste good, even though it could taste good if it had a healthy plant. So yeah, it's kind of a little bit of a balance between the two in my mind.
Yeah, and generally speaking, an indeterminate tomato will taste better than a determinate for that reason. But as we've seen with a variety like BHN 589, it's determinate, but it has a pretty big plant and produces some really tasty fruit. And I think just a general concept is that the more resistances or any particular trait that's not flavor that you're trying to cram into a tomato through breeding, if that's really what the focus is getting those resistances or other traits, you're going to be emphasizing that. And if it comes down to choosing between a variety that tastes really good but doesn't have the resistance that you desperately need, and one that tastes kind of mediocre and it has the resistance you desperately need, you might be inclined as a breeder to introduce the not so good tasting one first. And so there's always trade-offs in breeding. You can't always get everything you want. It's really hard to put everything that anybody wants into one single variety. But it can be done. It just takes time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned with determinates and that you're seeing kind of a trend toward more growers using determinates in tunnel systems and in general. And we had a number of people ask questions about, different, determinate hyloom potentials or determinate cherries. Are you guys seeing any of those type of varieties coming down the pipes or more of those available?
Yeah. Short answer,
Great.
yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's well, determinate cherries, there are a number of them out there. They tend to like produce a huge flush of very watery tasting cherries and then they're done. And then the heirloom type determinants is something we're just starting to see some varieties percolate through the system. So hopefully we'll be having something to offer with good flavor in the next few years.
Yeah, and a lot of the small fruited determinants are bred for labor saving, and part of the labor saving is to harvest them mechanically. So they are pretty tough and aren't focused on the eating quality as much. But yeah, I think it's changing, especially with the movement, which we didn't mention. But there's also a big movement in the container garden, dwarf tomatoes and really small tomatoes, which it's even harder to get flavor in some of those. But think I feel like that kind of trend of small garden, small space varieties is also helping have breeders who have determinate cherries focus on the flavor a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. You answered another question too in that answer. So well done. Another thing that came up either from people who are in warmer regions or from people who are noticing in northern regions that they're seeing warmer summers is, a focus on breeding more heat resistant types. And I wonder if you could maybe talk about that and if you're seeing those, trends as well, or maybe even a couple of the varieties that we have that really excel in that domain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mentioned Estiva, which is an indeterminate, really flavorful, sort of smaller, not quite a beefsteak. And then now we're selling a variety called Jolene, which is a determinate, large fruited, big beefsteak. And both of those set fruit really well in high heat. I think my understanding is it's very challenging to deliberately breed something that keeps its flowers in the heat. And I think what happens is you have a lot of companies doing a lot of breeding work in Florida and Mexico, and they will just observe in the field certain varieties in their breeding program that have that ability, and they like to put those varieties forward as what they call their heat set varieties. And so when I go down south to look at varieties with a breeder, I'll ask them to show me what they have for heat set. But as with flavor, that heat set trait is very desirable, but you may get a heat set tomato but not get necessarily the resistances that you want in the same tomato. You know what I mean? Like it's hard to match that trait up with a lot of other things. So sometimes, ironically, you have a variety that does really well in the southern heat, but it doesn't have enough resistance to beat all the southern diseases. So, and I have found as a product manager talking to breeding companies, it's almost that they're reluctant to claim that a variety is a true heat set variety, because there's no, actual test for it other than to grow it out in the field, and the weather is always different, and hot spells can take different forms and last different amounts of time, so it's really hard to nail down. And so it's actually challenging to get it out of them sometimes, like, which one is the heat set variety? Tell me.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think asking along with that is asking your neighbors if if they're seeing things anecdotally, because of course there's microclimates, and yours just might even surprise us if there's a variety that's doing really well in heat. I'll also add that a lot of the high tonal varieties tend to set well in the heat. That's kind of what one thing I evaluate for. I know Maine's not the proving grounds for the highest heat, but in the tunnel on the upper trusses, it can knock a lot of flowers off. And just some varieties that are in that category that are kind of my checks now is actually Lemon Boy Plus and Rosa and Geronimo are really some of the best heat set ones in my observations.
Great. Another question that we had, I think pretty much all of the tomatoes we've talked about are hybrids. Folks are wondering if there are any breeders working on open pollinated varieties as well, or if you're seeing many of those that are exciting coming down.
Yeah, always. I think Dan is a lot more in tune with some of those breeding efforts, but yeah, it never really goes out of style. I think tomatoes are probably the most bred vegetable crop in the world. Larry Cipolla is a good example, and you can do a lot with selection in the field versus the more technical way of breeding with the marker selection and stuff. You just need to have a lot of space and a lot of patience. But yeah, I personally don't care if it's an OP or a hybrid as long as it works. But it just happens that for a variety of reasons, it's easier to breed hybrids in a way, because you can get you have two parents, so you can combine two different things and get more traits that you want in the finished variety, versus an open pollinated variety kind of has the genes that it's got, and you kind of have to hope that it has certain resistances and that you can select for in a population. So it's kind of, hybrids are kind of a shortcut. They also, allow for intellectual property protection, because if you own the parent lines, nobody else can recreate the hybrid. I think that's frankly why it's attractive to a lot of breeding companies, but really it's the breeding advantage that you get from it. But Dan, I don't know if you wanted to highlight some OP stuff.
Yeah, I think the one point I wanted to add was you kind of touched on it there, but it's a quicker way to get disease resistance in particular. But essentially, the two parents of the hybrid are both OPs. So sometimes when we're looking for something in particular, there might be a parent line that's actually a really nice OP that gets presented to us just because it has some of the traits that we are looking for on its own. But yeah, there's a lot of growers that are small growers or seed savers really that are creating their own varieties. And in a way, some of those varieties are, for us in particular, are kind of a small market. Might not sell as much as some of the other varieties. So we pass on some really nice OP varieties, but might consider them as material for our program or something like that. Yeah.
Great. And then, one other question that kind of came up as we have some of these, varieties that have a name recognition. An example that was given was like Big Beef, and then it becomes Big Beef Plus. One of the questions was, how or what characteristics have to be maintained when like modifying that kind of tomato to still like use that original name? It's a little bit of a technical question, but I'm wondering if you could, you know, kind of pull away the curtain on that one.
Well, it's not legal to use the same name for a different variety that's, you know, different genetics, which is why they add the plus modifier to it, so it's technically not the same name anymore. So really, that's the only rule. If it's a different variety genetically, then it has to have a different name. But the breeding process is interesting. You know, to do something like Big Beef Plus, I don't know if I want to get too in the weeds on it, but you can take Big Beef itself and then take a variety as a parent donor that has the resistance genes that you want, or whatever genes that you want, and you can do what they call a back cross to get those genes into Big Beef. It just takes a lot of time, and in theory, the end result is that the Big Beef Plus would be very genetically similar to the original Big Beef. And it's kind of a debate, because the breeders of those types of varieties who do that process will swear up and down that it's identical to the original. Well, it never is, because through all those different breeding generations, genetic material moves around, and you never get exactly the same thing in the end. But I think that they do a lot of testing to ensure that it is similar. And of course, we wouldn't pick up those varieties if we didn't feel that they were, you know, good representation of what the original was.
I have, this is a little bit, you know, kind of, I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions. I have a question that's not quite on the breeding side, but was asked by a couple people, you know, just in terms of how we determine whether something is a high tunnel tomato versus a field grown variety. So what are the kind of those key characteristic differences of the tomato that we would call a high tunnel or a greenhouse tomato versus a field grown variety?
I'll let Dan take that one.
Dan.
He knows things. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mentioned a few of the traits already that would be, I would say, required of a high tunnel variety is the leaf mold resistance, at least, yeah, for us. And um, the other one was the heat set potential. Hopefully it has it, but I'm always looking for that. But in addition to those, for I would say the majority of our customers that are growing indoors, one of the main reasons is earliness. So earlier fruit set, not just the first fruit, but a lot of fruit. The yield starts really early on those varieties. The plants from plant to plant are more uniform, because one system is to prune to a single liter or 2 liters, and that's what a large percentage of our customers do. And if you have a plant that's segregating for if it's going to stay indeterminate or go determinate on one of those liters that you have, it really reduces your production overall. So they have to be very uniform plant to plant. Typically, Pete mentioned the seed quality is usually a lot higher, so you can expect really high germination out of them. That's more on the breeder side to decide that than us, but I think those are the main things I can think of. Yeah.
Well, and the kind of the polite plant habit in general helps too. A very
Mm,
vegetative plant can be kind of cumbersome in a tunnel and
totally. Yeah.
create a lot of work.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. And then just one last question, kind of a fun one. People were asking for your personal favorite varieties. So we're wondering if each of you maybe could give a top three.
Top three. You want
Well,
to go first?
sure. Yeah, I think my favorite one to eat is Glacier, which is just a weird little determinate cocktail tomato. It's an OP, and it's super duper early, and it produces this huge flush of fruit and then just dies. But they are so delicious, and it's fun because they're always the first tomato. Maybe that's why I think they taste so good. But and then the one that I never shut up about is Estiva, the one we showed that big long cluster of beautiful fruits. I think that's kind of a hidden gem in our catalog. You know, indeterminate field tomatoes are not as popular as they used to be, so we don't sell a ton of it, but it just cranks out the most beautiful fruit. Very, very tasty, classic red tomato flavor. And I gotta have a third one. I don't know. I'll let Dan go and maybe I'll think.
You can come back. Yeah, I'd put Carolina up there, which is a
Yeah.
Oxheart variety, hybrid variety, but which is developed for the indoor growing, but it works really well in the garden or anywhere really. It's just a much more productive version of the Oxheart that doesn't lose any of the qualities of that meaty, tasty tomato. And then Captain Lucky is,
Mm.
I don't know if it's number one, but I thought Pete would mention it too. But
Yeah.
that's been one that just always blows us away on the flavor side. It's not quite as
Yeah.
productive, but has a really good eating quality.
Yeah. I would say that is the best eating beefsteak tomato we sell, in my opinion, and also an OP. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true.
Great. Thank you, guys.
Yeah,
And now Joshua's back to wrap us up too.
Here I am. Thank
Yeah.
you, Dana. Thank you for moderating the Q&A for us. Thank you, Pete and Daniel, for the information-packed presentation that you gave us today. Very nicely done. We're sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions with the time that we had. We do invite you to explore johnnyseeds.com to learn more about these tomatoes, the disease pressures that Pete and Daniel touched upon. If you still haven't found the answers or solutions you're looking for, please reach out to us. We can take your questions via live chat, email, or by phone, and our experts will be more than happy to help you. That's what we're here for. For those of you who joined us today, and for everyone who registered for this webinar, you will receive an email later today with a link to this event's webpage, the same webpage that you registered for this event. A recording of today's presentation will be saved there, along with the slides and resource links that were discussed today. The slides and recording will be available on Monday, January 23rd, so keep an eye out for those items. And finally, thank you to all of you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we look forward to having you join us again. Until next time, best wishes from the employee owners at Johnny's, and thank you.
Bye. Thanks.
So yeah,
Bye.
thank you.